everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. We'll just begin shortly. Oh, I think we've hit the 20 participant mark. So I think we'll begin now. So hello everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Sneha from IT for Change. A very warm welcome to this learning session on decoding digital sequence information, a development perspective. A learning session co-organized by the Third World Network and IT for Change with support from the FES. Before we begin this stimulating conversation, I would like to run through the house rules for this session. This learning session will last 120 minutes. The first 90 minutes will be a moderated conversation between the panelists, followed by a 30-minute Q&A session. Audience members' audios and videos will be disabled during the first 90 minutes of the session. You may use the Q&A or chat features at the bottom of your screens to share your questions or comments during this time. Audience members' audio may be activated during the 30-minute Q&A session. Please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen during this time, and we will enable your audio so you may directly ask your questions to the speakers. Hate speech of any kind will not be tolerated during this session. Audience members making such comments will be removed from the session immediately. This discussion will be recorded and streamed live on IT for Change's YouTube channel and Facebook Live. My colleague will be sharing links to both these lives in the chat box now. Please feel free to tweet or share insights from the session on your social media, and do tag us at IT for Change. This session will be moderated by Anita Gurumurthy. Anita is a founding member and executive director of IT for Change. She works on digital economy and society issues with a focus on the political economy of development. She writes regularly on the digital connection to social and gender justice. Anita, please begin the discussion for this evening by introducing our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sneha. Am I audible? All okay?
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah. So welcome to everyone. This session on digital sequence information, a development perspective, is organized by the Third World Network and IT for Change, and it's supported by FES. I'm Anita Gurumurthy from IT for Change, and I will moderate today's discussion. This partnership is a result of extensive engagement around the digital economy that we have had with the Third World Network. Animated discussions about accelerating concerns we've had in the past couple of years around global justice in the digital age. As digital justice advocates, we have noted with some worry the infinite possibilities that the innovation economy, so to speak, has discovered to codify and commodify nature and bioresources. The rhetoric around the fourth industrial revolution technologies is singularly celebrated. Data technologies and biotechnologies have made possible huge strides in what is known as synthetic biology. The biorevolution in high-value applications, again, so to speak, is expected to have an annual economic impact of $2 to $4 trillion in the next few decades. As a chief functionary of a leading biotech research firm recently said, working with the physical world is becoming increasingly digital. Biology is therefore becoming a technology business. So much like in any other moment of technological innovation, the digital biorevolution has opened up a host of questions about who has control over these technologies. To what ends are these technologies being used, who gains, who loses, and what the consequences are of these developments on the well-being of people and planet alike. In this learning session, we take up these questions with respect to one critical technological advancement of the digital biorevolution, specifically digital gene sequencing. With two leading civil society voices, we are honored to have with us, who've been working on global governance issues of biodiversity, Edward Hammond and G. Oakley. Welcome to both of you. Edward Hammond is a researcher and writer active on policy issues relating to biodiversity, agricultural genetic resources, infectious disease, laboratory biosafety, and intellectual property. His consultancy, aptly called prickly research, aims to be a thorn on the side of its research subjects, typically multinational corporations, universities, and government agencies. Edward serves on the Convention on Biological Diversity's ad hoc technical expert group on digital sequence information, and is one of just 2 civil society representatives in the working group to enhance the multilateral system of the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. Welcome on board, Edward.
Thank you.
Yokling is an international lawyer whose areas of expertise include the environmental, social, and economic impacts of globalization, especially in the countries of the Global South. Since 1993, Yokling has worked closely with key negotiators, scientists, and NGOs to campaign for economic and ecological justice. She's currently Executive Director of Third World Network. Thanks for giving us your time today, Yokling, and thank you for also introducing us and bringing on board Edward. So we will begin with, and Sneha has already laid this out, but for people who got into the webinar a little bit later, I would just like to say that we will have a few rounds of initial conversation, maybe for an hour or so. So this is mainly a learning session, so there are no pressures. It's not about timekeeping. It will be a little bit fluid, and it will also include an audience question and answer. So once we kind of go over a few critical issues, we will open it up, and you could certainly raise your hand, and we can have your mic unmuted so that you can raise your questions. As the conversation progresses, please feel free to put your questions on the Q&A. We can also pick that up and have a discussion. I do think that too much interaction on the chat window could get distracting, but of course we do encourage you to have a rich conversation. So let me begin with you, Edward. Stepping back from the technical jargon, what is the term digital sequence information refer to, and what is the etymology of the term? So how did it exactly get into global policy discussions? To put it differently, by adding the words digital to sequence information, genetic sequence information, what is being called to attention, and why is the datafication of genetic sequences a turning point today in the political economy of biodiversity resource governance? Over to you.
Sure. Thanks. Well, the term arises, I guess in order to understand what the term is meant to signify, you have to go about one step backward, and that is beginning with the Biodiversity Convention, which was signed in 1992 in the big Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. Countries began a process to try to, countries' sovereignty over their biodiversity was more formally recognized in international law, and countries all around the world began a process of creating regulations around access to biodiversity. So if a company or an academic researcher from abroad came, there would be certain legal requirements that they were obliged to follow in order to take samples of biodiversity out of the country. And these were generally intended to ensure that benefits from the use of that biodiversity would flow back to the country of origin. So about 10 years ago, after the subsequent completion of the Nagoya Protocol, which sort of further concretized those requirements for access and benefit sharing laws, is what it's called, under the Biodiversity Convention. I think some of us in the NGO world began to realize that that the ever cheaper and ever faster sequencing technology was enabling the transfer of the full sequences of organisms and related information internationally in a digital form, and that these transfers were potentially evading all of the laws that countries had set up, particularly developing countries that are very biodiverse. And so companies or other users in industry or in academia were obtaining these genetic resources by an electronic means, and in obtaining them that way, they didn't have to sign these agreements that would require them to share benefits from any resulting inventions or products or anything like that. Now, the specific term, a number of years ago, I will tell my story of the origin of the term. I know that there's a couple of other ones, but I think mine is right. A number of years ago, I was on the biodiversity panel on synthetic biology, and so we were discussing the implications of synthetic biology for the Biodiversity Convention. And Jim Thomas, who works for a Canadian-based NGO called the ETC Group, was also on that panel. And we were both talking about this problem that we saw about sequence information undermining access and benefit sharing laws nationally. And Jim preferred to use the term digital sequences, and I preferred to use the term sequence information. In any event, in this committee's discussion, we managed to lodge the issue on the agenda, and in the report of the committee, after the session where we discussed it, the member of the Secretariat, the UN employee who was one of the people that was overseeing the discussion, came up to me and said, well, what is it? Is it that it's digital sequences, or is it that it's sequence information? Which is it? What's the important thing here? And I said, well, it's important that it's information and that it's sequences, but it's also, digital is also important too, because that implies this mobility and now I think processability of the information. I said, so it's really both. So I think that that's really the origin of the term digital sequence information, was that Jim Thomas was saying digital sequences and I was saying sequence information, and the two of them got brought together. So that's literally, I believe, where the term comes from. Now, what does the term mean? The answer is that we don't know quite yet. It's informally, it is a placeholder term, meaning that governments are discussing this thing called digital sequence information without having formally agreed on a definition for it. I think that everybody that's in the conversation, so all the governments and any other organizations or industry is there, of course, as well, would agree that digital sequence information includes the direct reads of the genetic material, generally DNA, sometimes RNA, from organisms in all their forms. But from there, you can go and move into lots of additional types of information that are useful and that are attached to it. So epigenetic information, which describes, how genes are turned off or on, or their degree of expression, for example. Most fundamentally, the information needed to assemble genomes, because of course the machine just spits out letters. You need to know how to assemble those letters into a coherent whole. Information about function of genes. So, and a lot of this is becoming more and more mechanical. It's a fairly well-known process, and software can take a big mess of reads from a machine and turn it into, stitch it together into a whole. So the exact parameters of what digital sequence information is have yet to be determined. In a sense, that fact has become a little bit of a red herring in the international discussions, because the people that really don't want to do benefit sharing for digital sequence information say, well, we don't even know what this means, this thing. But really, we do know what it means, and it's just a question of how broadly we draw a circle around it. Yeah, in any event, and to answer sort of specifically on the question of digital, that what that is intended to imply is this mobility. I think we initially intended the mobility. I think that also more and more its sort of processability is becoming relevant. So to conclude, I think that what is pretty clearly the case is that what's going to happen is that eventually the Biodiversity Convention in its discussions of this will come to a definition, and it will be kind of a de novo term, and this happens a lot in these international negotiations. I mean, they can, governments can come together in an agreement and define anything to mean anything, and so we will ultimately come to an agreement on what the parameters of digital sequence information are, and maybe just keep the term but assign it a specific scope, or maybe we'll come up with an alternative term. But at the end of the day, it is the sequences and associated information that are useful commercially, plus those together are what it will refer to, and we'll work out the fine details in the coming years.
Yes. Thanks, Edward, for that interesting story on the history of the nomenclature. I think to mobility and processability, I would also add value creation. You did mention the commercial value right at the end. So that mobility and processability, and the word digital, which cannot be taken away from the genetic sequencing, whether it's whatever else it's called, the digitality of it certainly references new modes of production in the fourth industrial revolution, and therefore new modes of value creation. So I will now turn to you, Yokling, and from your own engagement with the historical processes of the Convention on Biological Diversity, I request you to tell us a little bit about this genetic sequence information story and why it is so worrisome. Why should biodiversity activists, health activists, farmers' movements, activists who stand for global justice from the South be concerned about this?
Thank you very much, Anita. It's a pleasure to be in this discussion. Edward and I have worked together for many years. He does the hard work, and I sort of, take the easy bits and I process it. So I just want to say thanks to Edward, really, who has doggedly been doing a lot of Freedom of Information Act in the US requests to just dig out, from universities and research institutions, from the government, all the should be public data, which really shows the train of the different actors when we think about biodiversity, from the field, from the forests, from the oceans, from our countries, and from communities and indigenous peoples' legacy, how that becomes a product in the end that is owned by a company in a monopolistic way through intellectual property claims. That journey from the resource, which is not about a physical resource, within which is actually knowledge. It's knowledge about how you use seeds, what seeds can grow best in what conditions. Very local intensive knowledge. It's about knowledge about medicinal values of plants. And a lot of culture is linked to the knowledge, to the language that's linked to nature. And I think when we talk about biodiversity, the Convention on Biological Diversity that took a number of years to be negotiated, that came into being in 1992, really came out of a big grassroots from the Amazonia to Borneo, where we saw the rapid loss and destruction of the tropical biodiversity. And it was natural that the movement came from the South, because we were still the holders of most of the biodiversity in the planet. That's not to say that we don't have biodiversity, in other parts of the world. And as we have learned throughout the decades, if you go to a desert, it's not a desert. The term desert is actually a very wrong word to use. There is diversity everywhere. And in some places, very intense temperature places, you find that the microorganisms are very, very, very rich in diversity, and they have huge industrial value. So we're talking about, that's why when the Biodiversity Convention was forged, it was really in the context of a demand from people, from the forests to the towns. And it was really a people's call that we need to save the planet. And so I remember we had a campaign of bringing 1 million signatures, including thumbprints from nomadic tribes in Malaysia's Borneo Island site. And we brought them with our friends all over the world in wheelbarrows to the United Nations in New York to present it to the Secretary General at that time. and we called for a global emergency action plan to save biodiversity. That really is the bedrock of where we have the negotiations that came to the CBD, the Biodiversity Convention. Now, we have three very important objectives. One is, of course, conservation, but conservation not as protected parts, where we cordon off, I wouldn't use the word commons, because indigenous peoples and local communities have customary claims, they have historical claims over much of the world's resources, but they use it in a very communal way. So when we use the word commons in the world of biodiversity or seeds, we have to always remember it's linked to a lot of people's involvement. Even pristine forests have human intervention. If you look at the Amazonia, right? So a lot of that information is available now. So conservation in the most dynamic, progressive sense. And secondly, the sustainable use of the natural resources. And third, which is very, very new to the whole international law world, was the fair and equitable benefit sharing when we use our natural resources, our biodiversity, and we get the benefits from them, whether it's research, knowledge, products, technological processes that we learn from nature. And these three objectives are intertwined and they're very, very important. And they form the basis of also the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture, the one in the FAO, what we normally call that the seed treaty. That was also negotiated based on the three objectives. So these two international agreements for agriculture biodiversity of a certain list, it's not everything. So the mother convention is actually the Biodiversity Convention. Now these three interlocking objectives are very, very crucial. So when we started, we did not think of digital information, but we knew the biotechnology, genetic engineering was already in the forefront, because the parallel negotiation was the Uruguay round of trade negotiations, which actually gave birth to the intellectual property agreement that we call TRIPS today, the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Agreement, right? TRIPS, which is now administered by the WTO. This was happening in parallel with the CBD. In the CBD, we went ecosystem. We went acknowledging indigenous people's knowledge and the legacy, and also historical responsibility for the destruction of most of the planet's resources and biodiversity, and the overconsumption was actually by a small part of the population, predominantly in the north, and increasingly our own elites. But in the other track, it was actually capturing all that was common, all that was communal, and all that should be public. And because of the advent of technology, particularly genetic engineering and biotechnology, the globalization of patents over microbiological processes, over microorganisms, even over plants and seeds, you could get away with it. But there was some kind of resistance there. And therefore, we have this kind of, you can opt out of certain things. You cannot, for example, in the agreement in the WTO on intellectual property, you have no obligation to patent plants and seeds, but you have an obligation to patent microorganisms. So it has this, but it's all around the technology. So when we were fighting for benefit sharing, we were thinking about actual physical stealing, what we call biopiracy, a familiar term. Seeds, samples, even soil samples. We understood microorganisms, but we didn't think of data. So, but luckily, the definition from the legal point of view of how you describe what is the genetic resources is broad enough to include information. And so this is important because the fight, as Edward was saying just now, whether we will be able to, why do we want to include it in the CBD? Because it recognizes that there must be benefit sharing if you use genetic resources. So we argue that information, data, DSI is related to the resource. It has to be part of the scope of benefit sharing. And why are we concerned? Because we see a few quick examples. In 1999, 98, we had an outbreak of a new virus that we did not know in Malaysia. I'm talking from my own sort of experience here as a Malaysian. Suddenly we had these cases of acute encephalitis where you're talking about, high fever and you are talking about attacking your brain. We had 265 cases of acute encephalitis. 105 people died. And we had no idea what was causing it, right? So it was a Malaysian scientist, a group of scientists in one of our public universities that tracked it down, and that's why it's called the Nipah virus, because of where it was found on an island off the east coast of Malaysia. And they actually identified it and named it, and we were collaborating because of the health aspect of this. It's as bad as Ebola, except that it goes to your brain and not your blood vessels. And we were collaborating with scientists from Australia, with scientists from the United States CDC, and guess what? We shared the samples, and then they got sequenced, And next we know, diagnostic kits, developed from the gene information was patented. In the United States, there were patents filed for monoclonal antibodies for Nipah virus. And Nipah virus also attacks livestock and animals. So you also have work around trying to find a vaccine. So lots of patents were all over the place. But where is the country of origin? It is not denied, it is Malaysia. And it was done through public research. So today, if you talk to some Malaysian scientists and policymakers, they remember Nipah virus. And that's why when COVID came along, and we see the sharing of gene sequences from China, etc., upon which many of the vaccines we're talking about, the RNA vaccines, are based on the original sequence information that came from China. So we read a lot about how China is not sharing information, they're not telling us whether it's really from the lab, etc., etc. But we are not looking at where the headline should be. The sequence information was shared, without which you wouldn't have some of your vaccines today. So we see in agriculture, we see so many places that the movement is now not taking any samples out of a country, but through sequencing the information. So, but then they say, well, this is then public property. Free access is for health. So I just want to, before we go to the next round of discussion, to say we are not against sharing for public health. What the CBD always get criticized for is that it asserts and reaffirms state sovereignty over resources within the boundaries of a country. That doesn't mean it's owned by the government. State as in the public domain, and within which we have indigenous peoples, we have our public interests, and we have a societal obligation. You can't take anything out of my country without prior informed consent. If you do so and you develop it and the benefits are monetary, non-monetary, there is equitable sharing with the country of origin and with the community from where it came. And that is the battle that we have to carry forward.
Thanks so much. I think you drew a parallel so beautifully and also in some ways very worryingly about the connection between biopiracy and data piracy. So we are talking about how then do we bring into the Convention on Biodiversity, certainly, but perhaps more importantly, even in the domain of data, some kind of international agreement by which the meaning of equity in the digital age can be redefined. I also recall reading one other story from Edward's research, his recap of Ebola and the Regeneron story, how the company used West African DSI sequence information that was found in GenBank, which is an open database, and through this open access database, Regeneron has received orders worth 400 million or more. But of course, it has completely avoided any access and benefit sharing obligations and not giving back anything to Africa. So it almost seems like we are getting used to this kind of actor ecosystem in which extractivism and profiteering just go completely unnoticed, or even if we notice it, we don't seem to have the mechanisms to enforce any obligations or punitive measures. So that brings us logically to the next round, in which I'd like to focus on the wider actor ecosystem for our own learning. So Edward, you have been on these very important expert committees, and so in some sense we look to you for the insight and information on where people and where developed countries are, what are those coalitions, what are those blocks, how are people thinking. And I think this is really important because in the lead up to the 15th Conference of Parties that is coming up later this year in China, and in the context of the post-2020 biodiversity framework, of course, Yopin pointed out so beautifully that we are yet to accomplish a lot of what was agreed in the previous round. But going forward, could you give us a quick roundup focusing on the stances of the players, the governments, private actors, researchers, developing country blocks, etc. And at first glance, it seems to me, on reading the reports of the ad hoc technical expert group, that there is no consensus, no surprise, of course, between developing and developed countries. But what do we need to really understand as civil society from these positions, from the standpoint of equity and global justice? Over to you, Edward.
Sure. Okay. It's a complicated scenario between a variety of interest groups. I mean, I'll take the government groups first because in some ways it's sort of the easiest. And I think in some senses the good news or some good news about where this issue stands is that it is one that that largely breaks and continues to largely break in a north-south basis. And developing countries are in a pretty high degree of unity on this issue. The general stance would be that that obviously benefit sharing is due from use of sequences, and many developing countries would further argue that there is that in effect it's nonsense to distinguish between an organism in the form of a sequence or information and an organism in physical form, and so therefore they should be treated in effect equally. Now that's not a view that's held by developed countries in general, but there's a bit more. I would say you might describe developed countries as having sort of two camps. On the one hand, you have Europe and some allied countries in other regions who would argue they would not accept the argument that the information is the same as the organism per se. But what they will do is accept the argument, at least they're signaling, I should say this more carefully, they're signaling that they will accept the argument that use of digital sequence information is a benefit arising from the use of biodiversity. And when it's used, that benefit sharing is due. And so that's a sort of a legal construction under the Biodiversity Convention that allows the contemplation of benefit sharing without acknowledging or without agreeing that an organism that exists in silicon is the same as an organism that exists in a petri dish, even though in the case of viruses, it takes about 24 hours to go back and forth between the two now. So there's real substance to the argument that it's senseless to differentiate between the two. But perhaps this one group of what you might call more moderate northern countries, is at least willing to go so far as to say that benefit sharing is due. We hope that's what they're signaling they're going to say, and although you never know until the last minute coordinations happen and they take the floor at the meeting, but that's where I anticipate it's going. And then finally, there's a more radical north, which would be more the United States, Japan, maybe South Korea, perhaps another country or two, perhaps to an extent Australia or maybe Singapore, that would take a position that information has nothing to do with the Biodiversity Convention at all, and would reject even the argument that the information is a benefit arising from biodiversity, and therefore benefit sharing is due. So we'll have to see how those different constituencies work it out when the actual meetings take place in person again, and I don't think it will be worked out until we have in-person meetings again. It should be noted that the U.S. is not a party. It's the only significant, large non-party to the Biodiversity Convention, but obviously still wields substantial power in the negotiation through proxies and allies, and simply because of the power of the U.S. biotech industry. But there are other sort of groups of players that are active here. Industry's position is rather obvious. I haven't heard any great willingness from the industry to pay any benefit sharing yet, and that shouldn't surprise any of us. I think probably a more interesting interaction and more important interaction that's going on has to do with the concept of open access, because a lot of the information that's being sort of vacuumed up from local databases, from sequencing that's being done in biodiverse countries through the act of publishing is going into these open access data banks, and the biggie among them is the international nucleotide sequence Coalition, otherwise known as GenBank in the US, or the European Nucleotide Archive in Europe, or the Japan DNA database in Japan. And they're all the same database. They coordinate across one another on a daily basis. That database system and some of its sort of proponents and advocates and members are what you might call very militantly open access, and reject any notion of any restrictions being made whatsoever on the use of data that goes into those databases. And there is a synergy there with the policy of scientific publishers who are requiring that data be uploaded. Data that's mentioned or used in published experiments needs to be uploaded into some of these databases. Now, so there is so I think as many people look at this problem, there's the potential to craft solutions that include attaching new terms and conditions to the use of these databases. That the databases will remain out there, but if you're going to access and use that data, before you do so, you're going to need to agree to certain terms and conditions, and those may include benefit sharing. But there's a bit of a conflict with elements of the open access community there that remains unresolved. I think that for a long time I thought, well, this ultimately the solution to the DSI question involves really a pretty monumental thing, and that would be to really overthrow the whole open access regime in biology. It turns out that maybe it's not going to be quite so difficult, because it seems as if many people, including some in the scientific community, including some in northern governments, are now willing to contemplate open access with terms and conditions. So what we may instead have is a bit of an evolution of the understanding of what open access means as part of a solution to this problem. Yeah, and I think that's probably the only other constituency that I guess I didn't directly deal with would be researchers. And there's the scientific community is diverse. I would say that there's in the scientific community there is fear about so-called regulation of sequences. I think that there are entities, particularly the private sector, that enjoys fanning those fears, because it's really useful to economic interests to have the scientists up in arms and complaining. There are other parts of the scientific community that I think are more sophisticated, and that particularly those that aren't commercially oriented, and that understand the equity issues that are involved here, and that are more sympathetic and more open to trying to craft a solution that works. Because at the end of the day, when you're talking about benefit sharing under the Biodiversity Convention for types of science that aren't commercial, that aren't intended or don't accidentally result in proprietary claims and big profits, that type of science is going to have the little to no effect will occur on that type of science from fully implementing the access and benefit sharing requirements of the Biodiversity Convention in the digital sequence information. Because those guys aren't generating monumental profits. They might generate information and ideas and research, and they publish that and make that available. So there's diversity in the scientific community, and I think that hopefully as the issue continues to be discussed and it's aired more and more, that more and more of the scientific community will be on board in understanding that coming up with a fair solution will actually help to improve their access to information to practice the science that they want to, because there is equity built into the system. But that's it's an evolving situation there.
Actually, I think as the open access in science gets closer to open access on digital databases so that they fuse and become one, it's increasingly evident that that openness is, in a sense, the free-for-all openness is really not a democratic level playing ground, right? So this is something we've repeatedly seen with big tech, right? So you have these gala events where you invite startups or these young minds, young scientists awards instituted by XYZ from big tech, and finally you cannibalize that innovation, because that's actually a very, very good thing to do. You support the open ecosystem only so that you can monopolize. So this, I think, is something that is quite evident in what you were saying as well.
Yeah, if I could just add just one anecdote in that regard. It's very interesting. If you look at some of the documentation that's been produced by the Biodiversity Convention in discussions about this issue, that you'll see that the International Nucleotide Database Coalition has presented itself trying to present data from its users that argue that it's a global resource. The underlying argument here is that they're trying to say that, look, us being a database on the internet that anybody can access is benefit sharing in and of itself, which I think is rather dubious. But, so they show, well, we have a certain proportion of our users are from India or they're from Brazil, and it doesn't seem to be all that unequal. Well, this is data from their web interface, and then buried much further down in the report, it will say, but we also serve, I forget, however many terabytes a day in complete downloads of the INSC database. And you know that a large proportion of this is going into proprietary databases where it's joined up with proprietary sequence information and where it's subjected to proprietary analytics that produce proprietary products and intellectual property. So the picture that you get from this, that they try to paint of their users being, somehow, they can't even say that their users of the web interface are globally balanced, but that there is at least some, user base in developing countries is a very inaccurate one because it doesn't include all of these just downloads in mass that happen with regularity, and that information is just being sucked up into these proprietary programs, just left, right, and center.
Yeah, thanks for that, Edward. Yukling, I think that we see this kind of trend of openness actually crossing over from biodiversity discussions into the health arena, and we've seen this in the WHO in these past few months. In December 2020, the WHO made an announcement that it was planning to establish, what seems to echo the gene bank's, kind of framework, a biobank, and all of that was about a globally agreed, sharing system so that we can kind of cut the bureaucracy with respect to access and benefit sharing, so that in the interest of the vaccine, in the interest of medicine, we could actually get to research very quickly without having to bother with all the legality and the boring access and benefit sharing regime. So I'd really like to understand why, you may think it's important to track this issue across multiple forums, because the question of data intersecting with extractivism is now presenting itself in multiple forums.
Well, absolutely, because this massive biopiracy, data piracy is not something that just happened with COVID. It's been happening for a long time, and as some of the examples we've been giving show that. So talking about tracking, this is, I think, very important for us, in this audience, in this discussion, because many of us are activists in different fields, different issues, different processes. We have to be watching every process, and we have to really share that information, because, as the other side are constant. They have a very clear agenda. I like the word cannibalize that you used just now. They steal, they do everything, and they do it very legally, and that's how they influence what becomes legal norms at the national level and internationally. So if we look at this whole issue, back in the H1N1 influenza, we had a pandemic scale, right? So remember at that time, suddenly we had all these H1N1 going on, the bird flu, we had SARS. And actually it was the Indonesian diplomats in Geneva who approached the World Network because one of the scientists from Indonesia had gone to a presentation and saw this presentation very beautifully done with PowerPoint and about gene sequences and how they were developing, diagnostics and possible vaccines, etc. And the scientists suddenly realized, wait a minute, the origin of those viruses was Indonesia. And we're talking about samples from people who got sick, who died, and we share those samples in the WHO surveillance system. These are laboratories around the world, which is part of the network of surveillance on infectious diseases. So the sharing has been going on all the time. And all the public health ministries in our countries will be the same who say, let's not put, they don't like Nagoya. Nagoya Protocol, of course, is the child of the Biodiversity Convention that goes into detail the rules and the obligations and the procedures for access and benefit sharing. That's the Nagoya Protocol in 2010 that was negotiated. And so so even in our own countries in the South, we will find the health ministries will say, don't stop us from sharing. This is a health issue, right? But at the same time, what happened with the H1N1 was then we got Edward to go and find out, just only the US database, patent office, right? What kind of patents have been filed, claimed, given, and we found this huge spike. So the minute there is detected, so here you have WHO, public health, ministries, we are doing a surveillance on infectious diseases. The minute you start having scientific reports and cases, industry moves in, okay? We get the sequences and then they start having all the patents very rapidly. So we saw all this spike. We published it, we took it to governments, and the Indonesian, diplomats say, help us to deal with this in the WHO. So we got together, the TWN, Edward, and very few people, all right, because this is not something that NGOs work on. And we say, hey, there's this thing called the CBD, and it has got equitable benefit sharing, and it covers everybody. As Edward said, the only country that is not a party is the United States. Powerful as they are in terms of the industry, but nevertheless, the rest of the world is I would say, near universal, all right, if not universal. So how can our governments who are parties to those legally binding obligations of benefit sharing, access with conditions and terms and prior informed consent, how can they come to the WHO and then behave as if that other treaty doesn't exist? So we did advocacy, and we said, and we got some of the diplomats who don't know anything about the CBD. We had to do a huge, what we're doing tonight, hey, this is a CBD, this is what you need to do. And we took it to the WHO and we say what you need to do is to have a framework of benefit sharing. If we have a system of sharing the H1N1 viruses of pandemic potential, then we must have a benefit sharing thing. There was huge resistance, but we managed to do it, okay? And that's why I think Edward and Champika, my other colleague, they are the only ones who are in this advisory group around the implementation of this framework. So we have a framework on benefit sharing in the WHO called the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework, the PIP framework. It was not easy to get, but it's there, and industry is obliged by accessing the information on the viruses from the global system shared by countries. They have to put in there's a formula for them to put in. So there is a real fund where we have benefit sharing. Should be more, but nevertheless, you have tens of millions, Edward. I think we have a number there. Maybe by now it's a few hundred million or whatever. It is there, but it's about influenza viruses of pandemic potential, right? So we say use it as a model. So there was a lot of discussion before COVID that maybe we want to expand it to other viruses, etc. Now then we come back to how do we make sure that the benefit sharing equity issue and all that kind of stuff is respected. In other words, the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol as the mother convention should be the defining framework. So, but within the Nagoya Protocol, it recognizes that there could be other situations in health, for example, or maybe even agriculture or other places where you may want to have a specialized benefit sharing agreement. So you can do that. That was part of the push from industry in the north. You can do that, but you must comply with the objectives of the Nagoya Protocol. Then you have a legal issue. If the lawyers here, they'll be thinking, oh, then how do you go to another place, like WHO, where the United States is not a member of the CBD, and then you say you have to comply with your obligations here, but you can work that out. It's a matter of good faith. So we say, all right, if you have a PIP framework, because if it's recognized as a specialized ABS, access to benefit sharing agreement, then it is in a way carved out of the Nagoya Protocol and the CBD, because now it's going to take care of that specialized area. But if the specialized agreement undermines the equity, benefit sharing, and the justice issue that is in the Mother Convention and the Nagoya Protocol, it cannot be accepted. So we need to work out that interface. Yeah. But meanwhile, that is going on. In agriculture, we have the multilateral system recognizing that seeds, genetic resources for agriculture, maybe have a different characteristic, but they still don't belong to the world for you to have no strings attached access, and then you turn it into private property. And this is the same with the Ebola example, right? The samples, the sequences came from a sample of a 28-year-old Kenyan woman. This is the research that Edward also did. It went through a number of European institutions where there was a no strings attached access to the sequence information in a database. We're not saying we don't want scientists to work rapidly to try and sequence and understand and deal with the infectious diseases, but where is the integral benefit sharing for the country, for Africa, in terms of the vaccines, the diagnostic kits that we develop from the samples? And so I think there are many cases like this, and what COVID has done, and today, even in mainstream newspapers, Financial Times, Bloomberg, even the Pope, members of Parliament in Europe, not just from the South, they're saying this is apartheid, vaccine nationalism, unjust, inequitable. So I think the realization has come that open access, as if nobody owns it, and then you give it to a few companies that make billions, not acceptable. So I think we are in a different moment. And for the post-2020 framework, which is supposed to be adopted, why is it post-2020? Because it was a set of indicators, targets, to slow down biodiversity loss, to increase sustainable use, to make sure that the Nagoya Protocol gets implemented properly for benefit sharing. All those targets were supposed to be met between 2010 and 2020. Guess what? None of the targets have been met. And so we're supposed to have a post-2020 set of targets last year, but because of COVID, the meeting has been postponed to this year to be hosted by China. And in the post-2020, most of the pressure is coming to make it conservation only again. So DSI and benefit sharing plays almost no role. So the Africa group has said, without DSI, there is no post-2020 global framework. This is the Africa group of governments, parties to the CBD. Civil society, ourselves, who've been involved, and others fighting in that process, say without DSI, there will be no legitimacy. Now, we may not get the full-fledged thing because, there are no negotiations going on, except for one virtual meeting coming up. So if we can get a work program that has a big foot in there of DSI, then we can do all the things that we have highlighted tonight, and that work program will lead to an outcome. And for me, the COVID experience is a positive thing in terms of making us realize very quickly that this thing called gene sequences, diagnostic kits, nationalism, proprietary rights, trade secrets. This is the moment for us to sort of galvanize our energy to make this an equitable solution.
Thank you so much. So we now move into a couple of questions, and I just wanted to pose the questions together because I think this is in the realm of courageous kinds of imaginations that we as civil society must have in order for us to break out of the definitions that are normally thrust on us. And I recall the funny thing that Edward said, that oftentimes anything can be defined as anything, at the start. So we don't want anything to be defined as anything. We want it to be defined in a way that coheres around ideologies, philosophies, and ethos that we really stand for, right? So in the realm of some speculation, but I think with your wisdom and with the collective wisdom of people here, we could go there. And I think there are two questions, and feel free to answer them in this way, which is, what political bottom lines are important to evolve a global consensus around benefit sharing on DSI, right? So what do we really need to hold on to from our lessons on access and benefit sharing even before the digital age? In order to actually have a benefit sharing and maybe also an access measures that really are not extractive. And relatedly, in order to solve that problem, I think that there is an elephant in the room, and that elephant is really about how do we conceive of this resource regime around genetic sequence information that is datafied, right? So what kind of a resource is it? So perhaps, Edward, because it might be good to have some audience questions, could you take these two questions together? Because they are, I think, one of a piece, although we intended initially to have two rounds. You're muted.
Excuse me. You'll have to give them to me one at a time, and then I'll do my best to bring it together. I mean, I'm a small thinking guy. So when you ask me what political lines need to be maintained in the meta discussion, I freeze up a little bit because I guess my head's down in the weeds a lot of the time. I mean, in a sense, I guess what I would say is that it's very simple that the principles of fairness and equity that emanate from the CBD. And I guess one thing that we haven't really touched on a lot is the recognition of sovereignty, national sovereignty over genetic resources extends into the digital realm. There are some that would like to create an enormous divide, a breakage in that there, and I think that the fact that for well over a decade now, it's been possible to email a small organism across the planet and to recreate that organism in a matter of a couple of days in an entirely different location makes very clear that we do have to enforce the fundamental concepts of the CBD and in the sort of digital world. Now, what is very interesting to me and what I see emerging is as a really interesting issue are the parallels that I can see between the way in which seed companies or potentially pharmaceutical companies are building business models around amassing enormous amounts of data. I mean, vacuuming whatever they can, wherever they can from around the world. So, it seems like it was only a few years ago when we talked about things like, well, we're going to, sequence the bean, the phaseolus, the bean genome, and that meant that a group of scientists would get together and pick a single representative variety and sequence that one, and then we would have one single genome of this species. Well, now there are projects underway to sequence tens of thousands of varieties of these things, and so this generation of data on an enormous scale and its quiet sort of vacuuming up into all of these individual corporate, worlds of information wherein, the companies, and you can see also in agriculture, you can see there are companies that build AIs to analyze, sequence data from particular plants, and they rent out or sell those AIs to the major seed companies. So the parallels between the data business that's starting in agriculture and also you can see it in health and infectious disease to the way that other companies that operate outside of the sort of biodiversity realm are also working, the way that all of our clicks and likes and all of that are being assembled into these enormous databases by enormous internet companies, and how that's being used to sell things or to manipulate us. And I see parallels in the way that those companies are operating and how that works, and exploring those and what insights that gives us, I think, is an interesting idea, and I hope would be a fruitful avenue.
So, relatedly, what then should we really look at in terms of an appropriate resource regime? Should we think of this really as intangible knowledge capital? Little on the lines of what Yukling was mentioning already is, covered within, what was the very, very intense discussions in the Uruguay round. So, or should we really look at this as something completely new, a resource that's an in-between resource that actually needs to be seen separately?
I mean, my view of like what's happening now in terms of the what you might call the digitalization of agriculture and biodiversity is that obviously it's an enormous technical transformation. Frequently, the ends to which the technology is put are old ones, adapted plant varieties or whatever. Sometimes they might be new, replacing farmers by producing food in quotation marks in industrialized vats, and so I think that it's a hybrid of both, and I think that initially I guess I was supposed perhaps I am operating at too low a level here. I look at this and my priority is to look at how the use of genetic resources has been transformed from physical to digital, and to see how we can avoid losing the progress that we've made over 30 years in doing that. And so in the first instance, it's a question of trying to maintain and advance equity in this digital realm. I hope that that's helpful. I don't know if Yokling has a more erudite and lofty explanation or thoughts on it.
I think this stage of our discussion is very linked to a comment from Alejandro Argumedo in the chat box, right, where he says benefit sharing for indigenous peoples has proven to be an illusion, and it has only legalized biopiracy. So are we pursuing a false solution if we talk about the same framing for digital information? I would say actually it is, benefit sharing has not only eluded indigenous peoples, it has also eluded entire societies, what we call the state. Yeah, as a party to the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol, is it the failure of those treaties? Did we get it wrong when we haven't seen the benefit sharing come to the country, let alone down to the indigenous peoples from where much of these resources can be traced, yeah? Including the digital part of it? I would actually say, and Alejandro, I think this is really a very good point to make, because we have had many of our, we have searched our souls across Africa and Asia. First of all, it takes so many years for us to get a national law that implements access and benefit sharing. And why is that so difficult? Because if you come from a society where you have central governments, state governments, federal systems, and the way we construct what is the governance over natural resources, including biodiversity, is a 19th century concept, right? So there is the issue of the state sovereignty, and I know this has been very uncomfortable for indigenous peoples, particularly, right? And for many of us, when you say the state has sovereignty, what does that mean? Are we then saying that the state can do what it likes? No, because these treaties put obligation, because in international law, in human rights law included, and the CBD included, the state has obligations. It doesn't belong to the politicians. It is peoples of that, the state, the country, right? So first of all, it took us many, many years for most of our countries to actually get a law done. And if the law is to get buy-in, it has to go through a very necessary national process. Most of our laws were drafted by consultants funded by UNDP or bilateral aid, Japan or US or European or German or whatever. And so, and it always went to the environment ministry or some forest-related ministry. So it never really got into. It's not like climate change that is on the top agenda of prime ministers and presidents. Yeah, and so I think because of that, I won't say that the whole concept of equitable benefit sharing has failed. It's because the governance of the resource makes it very hard to implement that. And even there is an obligation to get prior informed consent in the CBD and Nagoya Protocol, including from communities and indigenous peoples. But many, even in good faith, governments and civil servants and policymakers, they don't know how to get that prior informed consent because they themselves don't understand how customary rights work. And in many of our societies, the indigenous peoples may have been so marginalized, lost so much of their traditional customs that there is no mechanism. But many of our countries still have a lot of indigenous peoples with their own governance systems. So you need to go through all those processes. And that is why it is actually very complex and difficult to implement. I personally don't think, or as TWN, we don't believe we should give up. So it is, I would say it is not an illusion. It hasn't been able to come to fruition because not just of the domestic and local problems, and we have many, because if indigenous peoples are not recognized in the country, then benefit sharing is not going to happen. But we have those systemic barriers of inequity at the global level, right? And as civil society, engaging in all this, we have to map all that, and then we have to fight them all at the same time in different ways. Because right now, for example, very quickly, we look at, you see, the reason why benefit sharing, you see, it's very uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable with the monopoly through intellectual property. So, for example, this big campaign, which just took off like that for a temporary suspension of the intellectual property agreement, right, the TRIPS waiver, that for the pandemic period, all vaccines, diagnostics, medicines related to that pandemic should be free. Now, here we're talking about commons, okay? It should be a public good. And we have got so much momentum for it. So what's happening now is the industry are just, we're talking about benefit sharing because that's what it is. The waiver is to say the ultimate benefit sharing is when you have a pandemic. We're not saying don't give you access to the gene sequences for pharmaceutical companies. We're saying all who have capability should have access. So we are saying at this point, have open access, but benefit sharing for all. The other side got access, allowed to have the monopoly, and we are all not having enough vaccines. Okay, so for me, I would want to take this period of the pandemic where there is a stronger awareness. So is it only about implementing Nagoya and our national ABS laws? Yes, but it's also about pushing back on intellectual property. So the suspension is only step one. The suspension call shows that this system is actually not just, it doesn't work for public health, it is detrimental to public health and also to food security and to the sovereignty of indigenous peoples over their seeds and farmers all over the world over their seeds, because we are moving to also take over seeds in the name of priority protection or patents or what have you. And the digitalization of seeds makes it impossible for farmers' movements to fight because they don't even know it's happening. Now, of course, nobody is saying that we're going to claim your gene sequence because it's a discovery. You just sequence the information, you didn't invent it. But so I feel that one of the areas we need to do some work for us, ourselves in the World Network, is there's a move in Europe to have copyright asserted over databases. So the sequence information everybody can get because they want everybody can get it because they want hours to go in there. But then the database becomes private in the company's hands, as the vacuuming, as Edward was describing. And then you see the rise of copyright laws, starting in Europe. They say we will now use copyright to protect databases under very technical terms. So for me, the battle is as much to push back the monopolization. Until 1995, medicines, pharmaceutical products, well, there's no international obligation to patent them. Zero. You can choose to do it if you want to or not. It's only in 1995 onwards that this is obligation. Why do we behave as if it is a Quranic, biblical, Hindu, text that this is something you cannot touch? I think that's the biggest challenge for us. So to make the equitable benefit sharing work, we have to push back on the obstacles, which include really intellectual property claims, which are very artificial. If we get to succeed to bring DSI as part of that national sovereignty, then the fight is national sovereignty is for public good of the people and the world. Then we can have a multilateral dimension to it. In cases of pandemic or what have you. We are trying to grapple with that. Nobody has the answers, but I would not throw away everything and say, let's have a new regime. Whatever that regime is, it has to be equity, justice, and recognizing the rights of indigenous peoples and the peoples on the ground who are the biggest still defenders of those resources. They can vacuum all the DSI they want, and they can try to substitute production with vets, and they are trying to do that. I mean, we are talking about now, plant-based meat. Next, we're talking about, you don't even need people or farms. Is that the world that really is, if we allow that to happen, then we will have massive destruction. Flip the thing around, who is feeding the world? Small farmers. And in COVID, small farmers fed the world more than anybody else in most of our countries.
Thanks so much. I think Edward and Euclid, that could not have been more erudite, and perhaps we don't have to have instant answers to be erudite. I think one important conceptual takeaway for me in this discussion just now is that we need to hold the line and, of course, keep our gains intact with respect to equity and benefits. At the same time, like Jochen pointed out, I think it's also important to think about bringing data into new regimes of national sovereignty, so that you're also simultaneously, and Jochen, in our work on e-commerce, you have pointed out several times that this free data flows also obviously has implications for DSI, right? And all these copyright that you talked about. And most often, data sets are held by companies under trade secrets, and therefore then this is a kind of an enclosure which is continuously feeding intelligence capital or intelligence capitalism. That I think gives us a good segue, because there are some very interesting questions, and perhaps we could have Vinay or Sneha unmute. This is something that follows from what you already discussed, Jochen, but perhaps you could take Eric's question, and maybe I could invite Eric to speak into the mic. We will just unmute you right now.
Yes, hello.
You're audible. Please go ahead.
Yeah, it was more a comment coming from Europe, because in Europe the analysis that is starting to be made of this DSI issue is that it's also mostly linked to the GMO and the patent issue. And I had just two comments. If I'm not mistaken, in Europe, seeds maintained by the peasants are not considered as community seeds or under the sovereignty of states, even though there's a big work of maintaining heterogeneous varieties, which are starting to therefore be free of access for the industry. And in the meantime, the European Union is one of the main actors pushing to have DSI unregulated under the access and benefit sharing. So there might be a way of acting by getting European organizations in the debate also, even though at the moment it's mostly the GMO issue. And the second comment is one of strategically importance, I think. In Europe, there's the intellectual property system is not so much focusing on patents, but on the plant variety certificate, which include an exemption for the seed producers, the industry, which the patent system does not have. And in the end, even though the seed industry in Europe is also pushing to have DSI unregulated, they are still facing a huge issue with the patent industry, let's say, because for them it means that they will no longer be free to work with varieties, to breed varieties, without knowing if they will have to pay royalties or whatever. So there might be also a strategic point to use between the industry's different strategy, or in the industry pushing for patents and the industry pushing for the plant variety certificate. Just to say that the industry is not a homogeneous world on this DSI and patent issue.
Edward, do you want to? Maybe I can quickly respond. It's true, because Europe has more medium-sized plant breeders, and that's why when this whole issue about, and the US of course go for the patents, and Edward can add a little bit more on this perhaps. And that is why it's true, because of the difference between Europe and the US. That's why in the TRIPS agreement, there is an obligation to give some form of intellectual property for plant varieties, new plant varieties. So you can choose a patent or plant variety protection, which is a plant breeder's rights, because of Europe. So there's a little bit of an option. Now, in effect, what's happening now is there is another treaty which actually came from Europe because of what Eric just described, which is really the International Convention for the Protection of New Plant Varieties, what we normally call UPOV, right? Now, UPOV, which was in the 60s, that came really because of the European breeders wanted intellectual property, but they didn't want patents because because of the different sizes, and they wanted access for research, as Eric described. But what has happened is, over the years, there have been amendments to the UPOV convention, and the latest version, which is the one that, if you want to join UPOV now, you join the 1991 version, and that is quite close to a patent. Yes, you can, it's okay for the plant breeders, the formal sector, because they can continue to do research, but there is a provision for small farmers. If I'm a farmer and I buy a protected variety of seed from the market, and then I plant it, and then from the harvest I see, oh, this year is a pretty good harvest, so I'm going to select it. So selection and plant breeding by the farmer based on a protected variety under a plant breeder's right. The rights of the small farmers are very, very narrowly prescribed in the UPOV 1991, to the point that you can say for use on your own farm, you can't exchange, you cannot sell. So, and this is a concern for many of us in the South, because we have so many small farmers. For home seed exchange and all that is so much part of our agricultural system. And most developing countries did not join UPOV 91. The last 10, 15 years, there has been an increase in membership from the South, because they were forced to do it under free trade agreements, whether bilaterally with the United States or with the EU, to join UPOV 1991. The TRIPS agreement doesn't say UPOV 1991 or anything to do with UPOV. It just says you have to have some form of plant variety protection. So we have a choice to do something that suits us, yeah? Which then can also give priority to small farmers' varieties, etc. So I agree with you, Eric. There is a difference, but the difference in effect for small farmers and seed biodiversity is almost indistinguishable. It's just a little bit less worse than a patent. And there is a research exception also in the patent case, right? But you just can't commercialize. I don't know whether Edward wants to add some more on this. But I do agree that we could think of how we can engage with the European side, with our friends in Europe, because we believe we can split this. If we can do something more in Europe, it'd be fantastic.
Sure. I can't offer any comment on the European seed laws, because they've always baffled me, because it's such a radically different situation than North America. It's an unusual instance of a very different situation. I guess, to me, the relevance of sort of the expansion of the sort of ever more aggressive implementation and ever more detailed and technically detailed, implementation or versions of UPOV, of plant variety protection, how they relate to the DSI issue, as I'm looking at it now, is that they're really offering additional new ways to make this information proprietary, because that to a much larger extent now, plant breeding is becoming an activity that is even directed by AI, by artificial intelligence. And so as I look at the expansion of these laws, I think a big concern is that they're creating more and more ways and stronger ways to privatize what are, in effect, public resources or farmers' resources. And one of the things that I think that's very unfortunate that happens in plant breeding, like for agriculture, but it's also something that will happen in other areas, is that I think more and more it's going to become very hard to know what the inputs were to any output, right? In UPOV, as is the same in patents, the standards to which intellectual property claimants are being held in terms of divulging the origin of the resources that have resulted in their claim seem to only be getting lower. I can remember 20 years ago being able to look at the reviews that were published by the plant variety protection offices around the world, and you could find a variety description, and that variety description would tell you where the plant came from. I think in the future, in this, and you can't really do that anymore. There's less and less information available about the parentage of proprietary varieties, and I think the application of big data and AI are going to make that problem 47,000 times worse. And so it's worrying to me sometimes. There's a parallel situation in health right now. Advocates of open access databases, in particular, it's not really an open access database, a so-called open access database, GISAID, claim that it's okay that countries should, health ministries just upload all of their sequence information, including their CoV-2 sequence information, to that database. And the claim is made that somehow there's a downstream monitoring possibility in the intellectual property system to catch later on when somebody has used that sequence information in an intellectual property claim. And I think that's bull. It's true, sometimes maybe you can do that, but I think that's generally speaking bull, because more and more the value in these sequences is in agglomerating enormous numbers of sequences, and your AI spits out a different sequence that's not necessarily traceable to the first. I don't want to say that's always the case, because there still are individual sequences that come from nature that are very valuable. But more and more it's going to become, untraceable. So I guess that's the issue, and those are the relevancy that I see to these laws. And maybe there is an opportunity there.
The last line, I think, was a googly from you, Edward, after you painted this picture of how things are going to become enormously complicated. You said there would be an opportunity there, so I want to hear you on that. But linked to that is an interesting question from an attendee who wants to stay anonymous. I'm going to read it out. And what I'm thinking as I read this is what you just said. So we're going to have these sequences, and some companies, let's say Big Pharma, is going to have several thousand sequences that it is going to really put through machine learning systems, which, as you said, will spit out new sequences through which synthetic biology will promise you the elixir of life. And then, of course, there will be greed to, see new patterns. And of course, we've heard dystopic stories about, what is that mechanism by which you CRISPR, right? So you have all these scenarios. So in some sense, and in some quite paradoxical sense, I don't even know if nature remains relevant. And I don't mean to say that in a facetious way. I'm just saying that if everything is convertible into data, then there is a question that arises about benefits. And that's the question here. If databases agree to charge for access to DSI and to share benefits with some kind of multilateral funds that distribute them to countries of origin, could this system, which is dealing with benefit sharing out of databases, also handle access and benefit sharing for genetic resources? So the question actually is, why have access and benefit sharing schemes, one for genetic resources and one for DSI, if, as you, Edward, said, that genetic resources and DSI are one and the same?
Well, I didn't say that they were one and the same, but the position would be a little bit more nuanced that a number of countries have taken, and that's that drawing distinctions between them is quite difficult. Let me approach this way. There are some proposals that I've seen. Okay, first of all, just to step back one step further, I would not call it a consensus, but there does seem to be increasing momentum behind the idea that there should be a multilateral benefit sharing solution for DSI. Now that, I think, in most people's conceptualization, so in other words, there would be a fund, but how this fund is collected, where it comes from, those sort of details are, all there are is just proposals, and there's no coalescing around any individual, solution to a large extent. Now, what we're referring to there is not every bit of DSI that will ever exist. We're referring to that world of digital sequence information that's already out there, that will come out there probably in the near future, but we're not talking about a solution necessarily, at least I wouldn't, that would extend to, say, indigenous peoples and local communities varieties that they are actively developing that are in their field and in their fields, and that they haven't chosen to they don't want to put out into the world. So there are scope limitations on the solution in terms of benefit sharing on GSI, right? It doesn't necessarily apply to everything. Some countries will have particular germplasm and sequence information that is very endemic, very national, that may not ever become part of an international system. Though I think everyone would agree that to the maximum extent possible, things should be in the multilateral system. Now, I don't think that, now there's a variety of possibilities for how payments are made. I wouldn't endorse having databases collect payment or administer it. There's a little bit of a mission. There's a little bit of a disconnect there between the ends. I mean, the databases are there to build databases. They're not there to improve in situ conservation of biodiversity by indigenous people and local communities in the field. But there's other possibilities. But what is true, and this is the reason why at least I would frequently speak about terms and conditions for databases, is because that's the point at which you can impose the legal obligation, right? So that when a company or when a user arrives and starts to use a database, they have to assent to an agreement, and that agreement includes benefit sharing terms. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the benefit sharing is a check that the user writes to the database. It could be something entirely different. For example, in the seed treaty, we used to talk about what we called the Norwegian option, which was Norway wanted to make payments to a benefit sharing fund for small farmers, and rather than saying that each company in Norway that was selling seed should do this much, they imposed a tax, and so the country made the payment rather than the individual user. So that's just one example of how it can be done. We took a very different approach in the PIP framework. In a PIP framework, vaccine companies' payments are calculated on the basis of past vaccine sales. So there's a variety of ways to do it, but it doesn't necessarily boil down to that necessarily database relationship. At the end of the day, I think you're moving too far ahead of us to say, would there ever be a possibility of having a regime that applied to both physical genetic resources and digital genetic resources? Because we have this history now, 30 years of development of access and benefit sharing laws. And in fact, many countries in some regions would say that their access and benefit sharing law for physical samples also applies to DSI. For example, the Andean countries maintain this, and if you look at their decision that was made way back in the early 90s, it indeed refers to information. So in fact, I think, if anything, the movement right now might be a little bit in the opposite direction, that countries would opt. And I think this is really important because it's the basis in many ways of the developing countries' power in this discussion, that the developing countries have the option if the deal is a good one, to hand over some of their national sovereignty over the genetic resource, including the DSI, into a multilateral solution, if it's a solution that's going to work for everyone. So, who knows in the 30, 40 year, scenario, if we're all still here and the planet hasn't melted, maybe there are possibilities for some sort of wildly unified regime. I think right now it's just as a practical matter, we're ambitious enough as it stands. So that would be how I would reply.
Yes.
The answer isn't one model. I think that's why we keep saying look at the PIP framework in terms of it's about just viruses of pandemic potential. And if you look at Nagoya Protocol, recognizing then there were a couple of questions in the chat about how about materials collected before the entry into force of any of these treaties, and that was really heavily debated in the CBD and in the Nagoya Protocol, which is why the protocol actually triggers the benefit sharing when you use it, recognizing that there may be all these collections, but when you use, then you trigger the benefit. And I think that's why if we try to give one solution or one size fits everything, then I think we run into problems. This is exactly what we always say don't do. Then we need to look at the different types of information, or where information is being churned up by AI and then spewed out in a different form. Then it comes, I think, somebody mentioned something in the chat as well. Is there a way like blockchains? Can you track? Can you monitor? Again, you see, for the purposes of intellectual property, the holders of the intellectual property have no problem tracking anything. They always track. They said if we can't track for biosafety purposes to be able to see whether a GMO is going to be out in the field, will have consequences. But then when it comes to enforcing the intellectual property rights, they can jolly well track everything, right? So I think maybe we should ask. It's maybe looking at the landscape. I think this is what needs to be done. So that we need to pull in, which is why I think having IT for Change and a community that's working with digital data and how the tech companies work, I think we need that knowledge to sort of say, well, if we think of it as a resource, right? Then what is the experience? How does it work, and what do we need to do? I think that might be, maybe we're asking the wrong questions. Maybe we should think about what questions we want to ask to get to some menu of answers. But the answers, whatever they are, the options have to be rooted in some basic principles: equity, right? The rights of indigenous peoples and state sovereignty in the best sense. And I just want to quickly touch on this thing that you raised just now, which is my personal obsession as well. About what's happening in the e-commerce negotiations in the WTO. This is not a set of negotiations mandated by all the members of WTO so that it becomes a multilateral agreement. For years, there's been a big fight over whether e-commerce should even have an international treaty around it. And e-commerce isn't about buying and selling on Lazada, goods and things. It's about really regulating the digital economy or not. And one of the most contentious issues going on in the WTO, which is this so-called plurilateral negotiations, is optional. They didn't have a mandate to do it, so it's actually illegal. But nevertheless, the Secretariat with some of the northern governments, backed very fully by the big tech companies, started this process. So we have about maybe 58 countries plus the EU, because the Europeans, negotiate as one bloc. So you have the EU plus 58 countries, including some developing countries who had no clue what they were doing. They think it's all about e-commerce. We can suddenly move into the digital world. There is a provision there which talks about no regulation on cross-border data flow of data, right? So I have had some interesting conversations with even people in my own government. They say, well, we're a small country. We want to have data should flow everywhere so that we can also access data because they've been told data belongs to everybody. It's a commons. So they say we are such a small country. So if we don't let our data flow out, we won't get data coming in that we can access. And it's like, wow. We were just saying for biodiversity or whatever, you may have very specialized information. And it doesn't matter how big your population is, or even if you're not a biodiverse country. Health data of every one of us is very precious. It's unique. And but if government policymakers and negotiators have that kind of lack of awareness, I think that's part of the big problem. It's not that our governments are prepared to sell out the country's resources and its data, but there's a lot of misinformation coming up from the proponents. So I would say, we need to track the different forums. It's not just where the biodiversity and seed discussion is going on. It's also looking at intellectual property, as many of us have raised, and also like e-commerce, where all these avenues are trying to do one thing: free access, cannibalize, vacuum. All these words have come up tonight, and then own it. Now, in the end, the benefit sharing is about whether it's medicines, seeds, products, technology. Then we need to think, how do we, capture that? So it's not just benefit sharing in terms of a profit share of your sales. No, what we're seeing today is equity access, right, to vaccines. Even if I have money, I can't buy it. So I think maybe we need to also think about what we mean by benefits as well. It was never envisaged to be a part of the profit. It's about building your research capacity, your knowledge system. It's non-monetary as well. That was what was envisaged.
Thanks so much. Actually, there are questions with respect to those as well. In the interest of time, what I'd like to do is to suggest that, with your permission, Edward and Euclid, will share on the chat your email IDs, so that if any of the people that have, we might be able to take maybe one more question, but I think we will run out of time. So maybe Sneha could share your email IDs, and I think what you were just saying with respect to even public value of data and public value of digital systems, there is somebody from both ends who has, hypothesized that it is important that especially sequencing data should be made public if it is actually towards public value. So there is already in the informational and knowledge domains ideas of the Creative Commons. There would, of course, be a lot of difficulty transposing that into the realm of data, because data then becomes intelligence, which is proprietized. But there should probably be ideas of public AI, or AI that is licensed through FRAND or other means. And this is the kind of work that people in intellectual property have been doing for a while. I wanted to just know from you, Edward and Euclid, maybe if you just had like one or two agenda in maybe very quick 30-second replies to take away from today's discussions. If out of the 50, 60 odd people that we've been here, how could we participate in some way in the agenda setting towards access and benefit sharing, towards the CBD, and understanding digital sequence information, and what kind of bottom line should we be holding as civil society? Quick reply.
I don't have a very precise one, but I think that one of the common threads is the way in which open access doesn't play out very well for most people in the systems, and I think that drawing awareness to that and understanding and drawing the link between how open access is very inequitable, has very inequitable outcomes in areas other than biology, but drawing biology into that is important to sort of contextualize the problems that we're encountering or have encountered in the area of DSI.
I think this is also responding to some of the questions and comments. I think when we are talking in the context of what we can do this year, because there is this meeting of all the parties to the Biodiversity Convention, and DSI will be a big topic. The post-2020 biodiversity framework is going to be probably the political outcome that they want to have, and we are very concerned that the way it's shaping, as it happens in also climate change, across the whole multilateral system, legally binding rules that were made that are based on equity, historical responsibility, the rights of indigenous peoples, recognizing traditional knowledge, and knowledge systems, beyond in the lab. See, it's not just AI, it's traditional knowledge that is actually the foundation of telling us what is it you want to sequence, as Kristen Moldasica said in her comment. So I would say, how do we in the next months make sure that whatever comes out, any decision of the Conference of Parties of the CBD will not roll back and dilute the legally binding commitments. In this case, we're talking about benefit sharing. If we won't get all the answers, but we're going to make sure there is a work program that is clear on DSI, and it will have to have a process. The expert group so far has been touching only on certain things. We need a full-fledged program that will look at some of these things we're talking about. So, and then keep our eye on other processes as well, so that we don't lose ground, elsewhere while we're trying to fight over here. And we need to have a bigger community to come together, like tonight. Thank you.
If I get 10 more seconds.
Yeah, please, by all means.
since we're getting more pragmatic than I thought, yeah. I mean, I think that we need more than that. The urgency of the CBD is really pretty intense, because the longer that this situation goes on, with we now have handheld sequencers that can go into the field, and in your purse you can carry something that'll transmit a sequence across an international border overnight. So the situation in the CBD is getting urgent, and there's a real need to. I think that more than just a program of work, that we have to have a program of work with clearly ordained outcomes, and that clearly ordained outcome, that charge needs to be one that sets aside spurious arguments and delay on the part of the countries that don't want to do benefit sharing. That's one. I think that another area that's really important, that's sort of unfolding right now, is in health. And on the one hand, you have the PIP framework, which shows that it can be done. I would reply to some of the skeptics of ABS and Nagoya Protocol. Well, there's an example where you apply the Nagoya Protocol. $230 million so far in actual concrete monetary benefit sharing, and additional commitments in the event of an influenza pandemic. So there's real stuff there, but we have now a parallel situation unfolding with COVID. It looks like we're going to have to, in fact, we're even going to use the same network of laboratories that collect influenza, specimens to a large part around the world. And frankly, the WHO leadership and the developed countries and industry are trying their damnedest to make us ignore the fact that we have a model that works for real benefit sharing for infectious disease. And we're about to start a period of years where we have to do the same thing, globally monitor the emergence of pathogens. All this global monitoring is being done by public health labs that are supported by national governments. And we have a chance to implement a parallel type of benefit sharing system for COVID and other potentially pandemic diseases. But right now the momentum is the opposite, because the companies don't want to pay like they are with influenza. So I think a lot of attention to what unfolds in May, June this year, and subsequently at WHO will be really important, because there's a huge opportunity there that we might be able to take advantage of.
Just one sentence. At WHO, there's going to be a floating by the UK and EU of a new pandemic treaty. Not about COVID and its inequities, but how do we prepare ourselves, better for future pandemics, as if there's no public health surveillance in the world today, which is not true. And WHO, unfortunately, the secretariat, I would say, is kind of complicit in this. So they just announced it a couple of days ago. Keep an eye out, and they want to launch this at the WHO ministerial meeting in May, I think. So stay tuned. I think we're going to get this kind of information out and alert governments and our civil society colleagues.
Just before this meeting, I was reading the report from Jan 2021, the report from the WHO on DSI, and there are two problems that the report identifies in regard of DSI, and both of them seem to me like red herrings. The first one is, it says, yes, there is a problem, and that's a problem about acknowledgement of research efforts of individuals. So we cannot actually, so that's the first one. And the second one, there might be a problem there about privacy of individuals, or, and nothing beyond this about, the abuse of data, nothing beyond this about biopiracy, bioprospecting, and the enormous amounts of profiteering that is happening on top of this kind of rapacious commodification of bioresources. That I felt was rather strange, just identifying, researcher, acknowledgement, which is so easy to fix, right? So if only the world is a lot more complicated, certainly. I think I would also take recourse to this caveat that Edward has used about the comfort of being non-erudite, but certainly with feet on the ground and our own experiences at IT for Change about the analytical frameworks that bring together the right to development and data debates with the right to development and biodiversity debates, which we are just about beginning to understand, and we certainly do not have the expertise to understand. I think we do need to combine forces here, like Deborah had remarked in her comments, to challenge these new alliances of capital and powerful states in the coming together of this fourth industrial revolution technologies, which includes, bio, nano, and artificial intelligence technologies. I think what we need to understand is that there are, as both Yokeling and Edward have reminded us throughout today, there are multiple possibilities that already exist, and that kind of hope to take away, I think, is really encouraging. We think that individual gene sequences, like Edward has told us many times today, have intrinsic value, and it's pretty much like a science fiction movie, but no longer a movie, and between the real and the virtual and back again, there seems to be a lot of mobility, and therefore, to paraphrase something from what in 2015 in the ad hoc technical committee expert group's report was talked about, I think it somehow seems pretty redundant today. And in that, there was this profound question that was posed, if you remember, Edward, about is this relationship between digital sequence and actual genetic resource, is it about a physical book versus an e-copy of the book, or is it about a piece of corn and the image of the corn? I think it's increasingly clear to us that it is really closer to the e-copy, right? And perhaps, in the ways in which we could combine and create new organisms, it could even be a monster out there, which is a physical copy that's very different from the original physical copy. But at the same time, I think that aggregation also matters, right? And we have been talking about how there's enormous big data sets and mixing and matching and recreating resources. I think that enhances the value proposition of the digital sequence. And I think this is why I think while the Convention on Biodiversity is a very important site for really pushing progressive perspectives, we might also want to think about other ways by which we should keep up the data battle, and perhaps even look at multilateral mechanisms through which we should think about data governance, ideas of techno-sovereignty, which we should certainly assert are not only the prerogative of European Union, but of course of everybody else. I recently read something that's very curious. So, this is a story I will end with. The Dhaka muslin used to be this fabric. I don't know if people who are not from South Asia have heard of it. Of course, it traveled places because of the project of colonization. And it was this very, very fine cloth, cotton cloth, which was made from this particular fiber called futi karpas. And this is something that grew in the Gangetic belt in East India. And it was abundantly overexploited, because of which, of course, no known seed varieties of the species survive today. But somebody in the UK decided very recently, because during these months of COVID, they wanted to hold this exhibition of, the old Dhaka muslin, and then they recovered, various pieces in the museums. And they also found a booklet of the dried leaves of futi karpas in the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, which is somewhere in London, near London. And what they did was, this researcher sequenced the DNA from the leaves and then took that sequenced DNA and landed in Bangladesh. And they, kind of went everywhere in the backwaters trying to find a plant variety that could be closest to the futi karpas. And they did find a shrub in Bangladesh, which became a very close match, 70%. what they did was they tried to grow this shrub, and now they have produced fiber, and they have produced various, the fashion industry has taken over the new age digitally produced Dhaka muslin, and they've held these exhibitions of, clothing, fashion apparel, if you will, that are worth millions of pounds. Now, this brings us to the problem that has been staring at us throughout today, right? Which is, who does the digital sequence information belong to, right? There is a researcher, of course, the researcher found this information just like various things are found in the hands of the colony, only you have to open the chest and then you will find all these gems. So there is a tricky question upon us about benefit sharing, and this has a lot to do with something that's very different from the original idea of genetic resources, and that has very much to do with the digital domain and data. And we cannot be left with rules for access or rules about computation of benefit that would simply be reduced to a monetary transaction of, I will pay this indigenous person, or I will pay you $4 for this piece of data. It cannot be reduced to that, right? So the ways in which we compute benefit, and today's, I think, very erudite talk really talked about various ways to think about benefit sharing, even a pool that is created at the national level. And of course, in development financing, there are always these contestations about taxation, development finance, all of which are very big questions, and to which I think set of questions we are also adding this bit about data and datafied intelligence and the benefit sharing that comes from datafied intelligence. But of course, we also have certain, I think, interesting developments in how the relationalities of genetic sequence data can begin to benefit from a community data thinking. What was mentioned earlier about communitized frameworks, commons frameworks, and what I think for change, my colleagues found was this material transfer agreement used by South Africa's Department of Health. And this is a very, very interesting framework. I'm sure, Edward, you know about this, but what we found very helpful in this was that there is an unabashed declaration by the Department of Health through this agreement, which is called the Material Transfer Agreement for the transfer of human biological materials, which are defined to include data, including digital sequence information. The notable features of this material transfer agreement of the Department of Health, which is thinking about benefit sharing, include the following, and I wish to actually read this out. It's very crisp, 3 points. The country of origin retains ownership of human biological materials, including in the case of data concerning human biological materials, irrespective of where the data is stored. So there is an acknowledgement that the data may not be stored in the servers that exist in South Africa. The second MTA, Material Transfer Agreement, applies to all providers and recipients of human biological materials for use in commercial and non-commercial research. And C, scope of benefits includes, inter alia, sharing information use of research results, royalties, acknowledgement of provider as source of the materials, which is the metadata essentially, publication rights, transfer of technology or materials, and capacity building. So I think that there is, even as there is a need for global thinking around these issues and multilateral frameworks, already national governments are thinking about different ways by which to assert their sovereignty and bring in new ways of thinking about the commons or the community ways, communitarian ways by which to socialize data value. So I would really like to bring this wonderful learning session to a close and request Yokling and Edward for more sessions as we go on, because I think that the vital milestones in respect of the political economy of these discussions are unfolding in the coming months. So maybe very soon we can do another debrief session when something significant happens. And I'd like to take that point to say thank you very much to Edward and Chi Yokling, and also to a wonderful audience who stayed with us for most part. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anita, and thank you to everyone. We have had an amazing crowd tonight, and so many old friends, so much knowledge here, a lot to do together. I think you wanted a sort of briefing, sharing information, but there was a lot of strategy thinking and discussion, so thank you to everyone. And to the team, to the IT for Change team for putting all this together.
as well. I enjoyed it. I hope that there was at least a tiny bit of illumination in what I had to say. But just following on your last comment, I think that an ideal outcome of all of this foment, or one of the ideal outcomes of all the foment around DSI these days, that I would love to see is a system that enables the sort of continued generation of localized knowledge systems and knowledge management systems by indigenous people and local communities that offer real alternatives to the problems that we see. And it's not a coincidence that these communities are also the people that are the only ones who are having any success in meeting our targets and in conserving biodiversity, because the broader outlook is not so great. And hopefully, if there's a silver lining in this, it's that a lot of the benefits that are generated would go to the purpose of really empowering alternative conceptualizations and alternative structures around managing this that have more beneficial outcomes on the environment and for people.
On that note, thank you very much. Bye, everybody. We'll be in touch.